is the sound coming through okay?
Yeah, I got you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah, we're good. Yeah. So, Mark, thank you for joining me, man, and giving your time. And I have your commentary right here in front of me.
Great.
And I'm going to give a
So
copy.
why do you need to talk to me?
This is so great, brother. Thank you. Every time I read someone's commentary, I think to myself, I know how much work it takes to distill all of that into this. So thank you, brother. Hours of work. Man, this is really great. I'm surprised at the depth of Colossians and Philemon and the resonance between them. And in order to even understand Philemon, I find myself I have to read back into Colossians to get into the theological categories.
I think that's absolutely right.
And what drew you to that? Was there, did you have a particular resonance with these letters?
I think the general subject behind Philemon of slavery has been something I've both been troubled by and intrigued by for a long time. So I ended up doing my master's thesis on the whole issue of how slavery impacts the way we interpret the Bible, because obviously that feels like a major cultural chasm that sort of has all kinds of alarm bells with it, doesn't it? And particularly because of say British imperial history and American history, the last Civil War and before, some of the resonances are decidedly uncomfortable, if not troubling. And so for a number of people, this seems a sort of easy slam dunk win against the Bible. And so I come back to that again and again, actually. And Philemon is a key sort of lens to look at it through. But then you suddenly start realizing the two go together in so many different ways, not least because they were probably in the same package. But in some ways, I think you can see the letter to Philemon as an outworking, a very specific and narrow application of the extraordinary truths of the bigger letter to Colossians.
Yes, I totally agree. And it's been surprising to me. Philemon's one of those books in the New Testament that it just sort of, you can check it off of your reading list so quickly, and it's hard to make yourself linger there.
Right.
And so we've disciplined ourselves at Immanuel right now to spend 3 weeks there, reading it every day.
That's great.
And what I'm realizing is just what you said, it's so narrow. It's this little snapshot of this tiny Christian church that meets in Philemon's home. And but inside of that little microcosm, you can see all of that beautiful theology of Colossians working itself out. And I'm surprised at how helped I've been. And we're seeing at Immanuel just light bulb moments. And someone said to me last week after the sermon, I don't think my life's going to be the same again. Because the high standard of love that the Apostle Paul is putting on display there it's beautiful and compelling. But we have to admit when we read, now the ESV, as I'm sure you know, translates the word bondservant rather than slave. And so I think it somehow makes that a little bit more palatable on the first read through. But then we read the footnote, and it is something we have to reckon with. There's this institution of slavery. And what do we do with that as Christians when we're reading through Philemon? How do we think about that? Because Paul doesn't seem to go directly at it.
No, absolutely. And at first sight, that seems to be one of the things that people stack up in their armory against the apostle. They think that here, he has all these sort of highfalutin and rather wonderful ideas about community life, and yet he seems to be uncaring and oblivious of the sort of fundamental social problems of the Roman world, and indeed to sort of live off the back of it. I mean, it's part of his privilege, his sort of free man's privilege, you could put it as. But I think he is just so subtle and careful, not in a sort of, I suppose, underhand way, but he just wants, above all, the gospel to be the subversive thing. So
Yes.
he wants that to do its careful heart work, if you like, and then if you the sort of applications, the implications should just sort of fall out from that. And I think he does make it a bit more explicit, and he's not very subtle at points in Philemon. I mean, he has the air of being sort of laid back, but he isn't really. He knows exactly what he's doing, and I think Philemon sitting there also would have known exactly what was going on here. He said, "All right, okay, Paul, I got you here."
Do you pick that up when he says, "Prepare a guest room for me"?
I think, I mean, basically, it's not that subtle there, is it? Basically, so I'm on my way to check it out. I'll see. I expect a report on my desk in triplicate in the morning, that kind of thing.
Exactly, yeah.
I think, though, he wants to make sure that in the end, the motivation for how the treatment of Onesimus is to change must be the gospel, not the threat of Paul's visit.
Yes.
Because that's counterproductive. That's not going to have any lasting impact, because as soon as Paul's not around again, or when he's in Rome and never likely to come back to Asia Minor, then, well, he could just carry on doing what he did. But that's the last thing he wants.
Yes.
He wants a radical life transformation.
I love that willingness on Paul's part to humble himself, to get that result of willingness out of Philemon. And I wonder, what would you say to that? I mean, it doesn't matter which country you're in right now. It seems like there's an undercurrent of revolution everywhere around us. What would you say to that revolutionary who reads Philemon and says, Paul should have gone right at this institution?
Well, I think there are times when the direct approach is necessary, and Paul could be direct. He didn't mince his words on a number of occasions, and even in the sort of public square. So he was in the Areopagus, or he was in front of on the Acrocorinth, the city center in Corinth. He made his case pretty plain. I think what he's doing here in Philemon is actually a pastoral work, a ministry to Philemon as well as to Onesimus. Because actually, he's not thinking necessarily in terms of the entire institution of Roman slavery. And we need to talk a bit about that specifically, perhaps in a moment. But he's here wanting to help Philemon, clearly an influential figure, but he's concerned for his own spiritual walk and discipleship. He wants him to grow and make sacrificial steps for the gospel, but to do it because he wants to do it and he knows he should do it.
Yes.
Rather than out of any coercion or fear of, the crowd or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think the subtleness and the sort of obliqueness, perhaps, of it makes perfect sense in that context, because he wants to preserve his relationship with Onesimus.
Yes.
So that's the context. He's not placard waving and rabble rousing at this point. Yes. He's got plenty of time for that in other places.
Yeah, no, that's true. Paul is very direct.
So I think, but what he is making very clear, and I would imagine, these two letters and perhaps others that we don't know about arrived together. Perhaps they've had the main one read out to the church. And we know that there were a number of letters that circulate. So, there's one to Laodicea and they meant to swap over and so on. And I've been to that part of Turkey, the Lycus Valley, and basically you've got Hierapolis, Laodicea, and Colossae. And each city, each town can see the other two in the valley. So, it's only a few miles between them. It's quite plausible that these letters were swapped around. But this letter gets read out, and I wonder, perhaps if he's not yet read the personal letter, Philemon is thinking, I wonder what's going on here. And then he gets the personal one, and he's thinking, well, what's Onesimus doing here? Okay. there is a demand on me, but it's not Paul's, it's the Lord Jesus's.
Yes, and I love that the point that you make there about the sharing of this letter. I think it was Dick Lucas that said, this isn't marked personal and private. It's addressed to the church, and there are plural yous here in this letter. And it's
Absolutely.
most certainly would have been a case study circulated around the ancient world there.
Right.
So it's not as if the Apostle Paul was naive to the fact that this was going to go viral.
Right. And then you build onto that and think, well, hang on, here that's a public letter, but here is a very personal, private letter, and yet that's gone viral too.
Yes.
And the implication is presumably that Philemon did as he was hoped and prayed into and expected to do.
Yes.
And he said, look, there are lessons we've all got to learn here. It might not be a runaway slave you've got to deal with. That's the sort of gospel barrier or the major sort of culture clash, if you like. There's going to be something else. But this letter can be a kind of case study of how sometimes the gospel demands some of the hardest relationships to be mended.
Yes. I was struck I'm just remembering in your commentary that you quoted from that, was it the Countess of Huntington, that dear Christian woman who was such a supporter of Whitefield and others. And you pointed out that she had this major blind spot and the level ground of the cross. So that's instructive to me, to not read this with my superior 21st century mindset, as if this institution of slavery, we're just so past that.
Right.
We all have blind spots, but as we look at this letter and we see slavery, I mean, what do you say to the person who is importing into that, the chattel slavery that tends to come into our minds when we think of, Wilberforce and those guys? I mean, is that the same thing that we're dealing with in the ancient world?
Well, the reality is that slave owners in the 16th, 17th, 18th, even 19th centuries would have said absolutely. And plenty of them would have used various texts from the Old Testament, but particularly places in Corinthians and Philemon and other places, which they would have said showed that this was a perfectly legitimate and normal thing to do. This is part of human culture since the year dot. And throughout there have been people who've argued that this is a biblical pattern. So we can't escape that, and that's certainly why some people jump sort of on the Bible now, because they know full well that that's exactly what people use to defend the institution. But I think there were obviously many abolitionists who were arguing the exact opposite from the Bible. But I think there are a number of historical things that we just need to hold clearly, because they put things into a slightly different context. I think one of the things that we've got to recognize about the Roman world is that slavery and race were not tied.
Yes.
So there was no sense in which if you were one race, therefore that somehow meant that you were inevitably constrained into a sort of social caste, or, to use the Hindu term, your genetics, your birth determines your status. Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think that was the case at all in the Roman Empire, and actually it was pretty fluid. It's thought that at its height, perhaps a third of the citizens of Rome itself, which was, of course, the first city in the world to have over 1 million citizens. I mean, heaven knows how grim it was to live there. I mean, it really was a pretty brutal and grim place. A third were slaves. And that immediately changes how you might think of it, because actually, in some ways, it's a bit more akin to a kind of proto-social security. Mm. On top of that, it was possible to buy your way out of slavery. So you might earn a small amount, depending on your owners. They might give you a certain amount so that over a period you could buy your freedom. And in fact, certainly within, I don't know, well, actually by Paul's lifetime, towards the end of Paul's life, the empire was actually being run at the center by some of the key people around the emperor who themselves were freedmen, but actually the most powerful behind the scenes people in the whole empire. Coupled with that, the fact that actually if you were from any Roman province, then it was perfectly possible for you to have full citizenship rights. Not automatically, because not every province did, but for example, we know that Paul was a citizen of Rome by pure virtue of coming from Tarsus, or Philippi in northern Greece, when Augustus, when he was Octavian, had a massive victory there, he, as a gift to his soldiers, obviously he wasn't able to pay them necessarily, but he gave them land, made them citizens of Philippi, and said, right, from here on in, you are full citizens of Rome. And so these statuses were pretty fluid and were not primarily related to race, so that in time you could have an African emperor of the Roman Empire.
Wow.
Now, of course, there were the snobberies and prejudices and all right, and there was a spectrum. There were, I mean, if you were a slave in the silver mines of Attica or of southern Italy, your life expectancy was very, very short. They were brutal and terrifying and awful, and you know, you wouldn't wish that on your worst enemy. So we mustn't discount the fact that there were some awful and appalling activities and treatments, no doubt about it. And to be a slave was to be a nothing. You were a possession.
Yes.
But it's fascinating how Paul subverts it. And I think in Philemon, you clearly see him doing that. I don't see how else you can understand language that going from possession to family and brotherhood. If that doesn't subvert the system, I don't know what does.
Yes, I completely agree. And I appreciated that you brought up this issue of skin color. I can remember Dr. David Calhoun at Covenant Seminary, a Princeton historian, pointing out that fact that in the Roman world, that these were not, you wouldn't equate skin color with class.
Right.
And, that seems to me to be a peculiar evil of the that we deal with still today, at least in the U.S. And you know, I'm just wondering if that really skews the way that we can read the Bible. And also, you know, just what you're saying here about the percentage of people who would have been slaves. I mean, almost certainly a large majority of the early church would have been slaves.
And actually, it's reckoned that it is precisely the way they were treated in churches that was part of the attraction.
Wow.
But take this as an example. I think it's highly likely that Luke, who hung around with Paul a lot, and you know he sort of flits in and out of the book of Acts, it's highly likely that Luke was a former slave. And the reason that makes sense is because he was a doctor. Now, we think that that's very prestigious these days. You know, an ambitious parent wants their kid to be a doctor or a lawyer, whatever. In the Roman world, that wasn't necessarily the case. And yet, of course, you had to be more educated. So you had to get the training, obviously not quite as sophisticated as it would later become, but there was quite a lot involved in it. And most people, either if they were wealthy, wouldn't dream of doing that because you don't want to get sort of involved in the yucky, horrible sort of bodily stuff. Yeah. Especially if you had a Greek mindset that wanted to be more spiritual and withdraw from the physical world.
Yes.
But if you were not like that, then there's no way you could afford the training. And so what would happen is that people would, if they had a bright and intelligent slave, they would pay for their training and then use them as a money spinner. they would earn off the back of their slave. It was an investment. And so for Luke to have been a doctor makes it very, very likely indeed that that's exactly his background, which explains a lot of the sort of threads and trends you get in his gospel and the book of Acts. He's concerned for those at the bottom of the pile.
Yes. And isn't it so beautiful that our Father in heaven has memorialized forever the lives of people who have just been not even seen, not even noticed. I mean, here we are talking about Philemon's house, like a tiny church that just it's dust now, that house is. And but isn't that just the way of God? And I love what you say about how they were received in the church, because I see there in Philemon, and maybe you can help me tease this out, because this is what I'm going to preach this Sunday.
Do you want me to do your prep for you?
That would be so great if you could do that, Mark. But there is this. I can't look at Colossians and Philemon and say the Apostle Paul was only concerned about what happened inside the church. But neither can I look at it and say, that he was wholly concerned with getting to the emperor to preach the gospel to him. But it seemed to me he's doing both of those things. I mean, he utilizes his citizenship to get a hearing with the highest authorities in the land. So he's clearly aware of his civic, that what's available to him because of his civic standing. But at the same time, I don't think that the Apostle Paul, if he were here today, his internal peace would not be tied to the election. And it seems to me that is a really relevant thing for us right now to learn how to do, to both prioritize what God is building in the world and at the same time be responsible citizens. Do you have any input on that world force? Because it doesn't even matter what country you're in. We're all we're all dealing with this right now.
Yep, absolutely. I would say maybe a couple of things. I think one of Paul's huge advantages is that he didn't know anything about the Enlightenment. So he lived centuries before that, and in some ways that gets to the heart of so many of our hang-ups now. Yeah. One of which, I mean, going back to the whole issue of race, actually a lot of the ways in which we think about race derive from the Enlightenment, with the supposed superiority of the rational man in terms of actually that means not women, and in terms of, well, that means not European and non-Europeans. So the white man of Europe and eventually North America is the one who really gets it and can sort of understand and grasp the world. So race is a key part of that. But then you have this profound division that actually, as Christians through the last 3 or 4 centuries, we have complied with unwittingly, but also sometimes because it's the safer option. And that is to split public from private, and to assume that actually you can have 2 completely separate worlds, and that what you do in private is your concern. So if you want to believe in Jesus, that's great. If you want to be a Wiccan, or you just want to observe the stars and be a materialist, that's all fine. You just do your thing. But then in the public square, this is what we've agreed. This is how we operate. You don't bring religion into it. You deal with it like this, blah, blah, blah. And it's all nice and neat. And we won't argue. But we've basically surrendered the terms of the debate.
Yes.
And so we live kind of schizophrenic lives. But you see, it's not just Christians. Everybody is. Even the materialists are.
Yes.
So you get crazy debates about whether or not it's important how a politician lives for what their policies are like.
Wow.
And it's not as clear-cut sometimes as Christians want to insist. I mean, sometimes I'm grateful for the stand that people have made on certain issues, regardless of their lifestyle. Or, if I need urgent surgery and I'm going to the best surgeon in the universe, I don't care what his lifestyle is like. I want him to do a good operation.
Yeah.
So there's a sense in which that's true, but actually we know that you can't take that to its nth degree. There needs to be some kind of matchup, and the person in private very often manifests in public as well. And so we've got to try and live much more joined up lives. I mean, John Stott always talked about integrity, which literally, it means a sort of unitedness, a oneness. Everything's joined together. All the pieces of the puzzle fit.
Yes.
And actually, I think that's what Philemon is about.
Yes.
Philemon, you say you're a brother in the Lord and that you've been saved so much and all of this. So how does it impact your lifestyle in the house?
Yes. Yes. I couldn't agree more, Mark. And that has been the surprising discovery for me, and I think for us at Immanuel, is this Paul lived, I said this in our first sermon, Paul lived in one world, and Jesus was Lord over it. It's so striking to me, he calls himself not a prisoner for Caesar, but a prisoner for Christ Jesus. And I want to thank you, brother, just, in front of Immanuel people. My wife and I lived in London for a year, and we attended All Souls Langham Place. And I'm in some small way, I'm a recipient of that heritage of ministry there at All Souls that prioritized the Word of God and in many ways informed the way that I wanted to preach in the future. And I praise God. I feel like in many ways our English brothers are ahead of us and sisters in how to deal with this divided, secular religious, how to preach into that reality. And you've just given us a beautiful glimpse into how to pull back what's happening. And because we want to live whole lives for Jesus. This Immanuel is a church that's trying to treat, our mission statement is to make the real Jesus non-ignorable in our city and far beyond. So we're trying to live in reality with Jesus. And that's how Philemon, I think, is helping us. So thank you, brother.
It's a pleasure.
And, whenever all these wretched sanctions are lifted, and if you find yourself stateside, we would love to have you here anytime.
That'd be wonderful. I've visited the church once. I think, funnily enough, when Sam Albury was preaching, he didn't know I was going to be there.
You came all this way to hear Sam preach.
Well, that, strictly speaking, that really wasn't my aim. I sat dead in front of him to see how long it would take for him to notice. And,
that's oh man,
yeah.
We love Sam. He's been such a blessing to us. Good grief.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Well, thank you, brother. And we honor you. We're grateful.
Anytime. Thank you very much for your time.
Oh, thanks. Awesome.